A man throws a cigarette from the window of his car. He does not stop. He does not look back. To anyone passing by, it is an ordinary piece of litter lying beside an Idaho road. But detectives are watching. They retrieve the cigarette and send it to a laboratory. Because they believe the saliva on it may answer a question that has remained unresolved for almost 23 years. Who left DNA inside Angie Dodge's apartment? When the laboratory result returns, the answer is clear. The cigarette matches biological evidence recovered from Angie's crime scene in 1996. After more than 2 decades, the unknown DNA finally has a name: Brian Leigh Dripps. But the discovery creates another disturbing question. How could the man connected to the evidence have lived directly across the street from Angie and remained outside the investigation for so long? The answer begins with a damaged DNA sample, a complicated family tree, and one relative investigators did not know existed. For years, investigators had one piece of evidence that never changed. The DNA recovered from Angie Dodge's apartment belonged to an unidentified man. It did not belong to Christopher Tapp. It did not match the other men investigators tested, and it did not produce a match in the National Criminal DNA Database. More than 100 samples were reportedly compared with the crime scene profile. Each one was eliminated. The evidence remained in the case file without a name attached to it. But while the DNA pointed toward an unknown person, Christopher Tapp had already been convicted. His confession had persuaded a jury. The physical evidence had not. That contradiction followed the case for years. Either the unknown DNA came from someone investigators had not identified, or the original theory of the crime was wrong. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, could not ignore that possibility. She had once believed Tapp was involved, but after examining the evidence and watching recordings of his interrogations, her position changed. She began to believe the investigation had produced the wrong man. Freeing him, however, would not identify the person who left the DNA. For that, investigators needed science to do something it had never been able to do before. They needed to search beyond criminal databases. They needed to search through a family. Traditional forensic DNA testing is usually built around direct comparison. Investigators recover a sample from a crime scene. They compare it with the DNA of a suspect or with profiles stored in a law enforcement database. If the profiles match, investigators have a powerful lead. But Angie's case had reached a dead end because there was no direct match. Genetic genealogy offered another approach. Instead of searching only for the person who left the DNA, analysts could search for people who shared smaller portions of that person's genetic material. Distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, people who may never have met the unknown individual but shared ancestors with him. The matches would not immediately reveal a killer. They would reveal pieces of a family network. From there, genealogists could examine marriage records, birth announcements, obituaries, public records, and family histories. The process was slow, and in Angie's case, the DNA sample was badly degraded. According to the genetic genealogists involved, much of the information normally required for a reliable search was missing. There was no guarantee the method would work. Carol Dodge asked them to try. So in 2018, the genetic profile was uploaded for genealogy analysis, and distant matches began to appear. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore began studying the people who shared DNA with the unknown man. She was not looking for one obvious match. She was searching for intersections. If several people shared DNA with the unknown profile and also shared DNA with one another, they might descend from the same ancestral couple. That couple could become the center of the search. From there, investigators could trace their descendants forward through time. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Then they could identify male descendants whose age and location made them possible candidates. Eventually, the search narrowed to 6 men. 5 appeared to have no clear connection to Idaho. 1 lived in the state. That made him the strongest lead. In February 2019, investigators placed the man under surveillance. They watched him discard chewing tobacco. The material was recovered and tested. After years without a viable suspect, it appeared the case might finally be approaching its conclusion. but the result was negative. The man's DNA did not match the crime scene profile. Even more confusing, further testing indicated he was not as closely related to the unknown person as the family tree had suggested. The investigation appeared to have reached another dead end, but the negative result revealed something important. The family tree was not necessarily wrong. It might be incomplete. Somewhere within the records, there could be a descendant who had been missed. A child listed under another name. A relationship absent from official documents. A branch that had disappeared from view. The unknown man might already be inside the family tree. Investigators simply had not found him yet. Moore returned to the records. She reviewed marriages, divorces, and family connections that initially appeared to lead nowhere. One relationship drew her attention. A man connected to the family had married when he was young. The marriage ended. The available records did not clearly show that the couple had a child. But Moore considered another possibility. What if a child had been born after the relationship ended? What if that child had later taken a stepfather's surname? That person could be genetically connected to the family while appearing under a completely different name. The search moved through obituaries and public records until investigators identified a son. His surname was Dripps. His full name was Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. He was the missing descendant. And when detectives examined his history, the investigation suddenly moved from a genealogical possibility to a direct geographical connection. Brian Dripps had lived in Idaho Falls in 1996. More importantly, he had lived across the street from Angie Dodge. The unknown man in the family tree had been close to the crime scene all along, but detectives still needed proof. A family connection was not enough. Living near Angie was not enough. They needed Dripps' DNA, and they needed to obtain it without alerting him. In May 2019, detectives traveled to Caldwell, Idaho, where Dripps was living. They followed him discreetly. They waited for him to discard something that might contain biological material. Then Dripps threw a cigarette from his vehicle. Investigators recovered it. The cigarette was sent for direct forensic comparison. This was no longer a genealogy search based on distant relatives. The laboratory would compare DNA from the cigarette directly with the forensic profile taken from Angie's crime scene. The profile that had survived more than 2 decades. The profile that had excluded Christopher Tapp. The profile that had never matched anyone investigators tested. This time, it matched. Investigators reported that DNA from the cigarette corresponded with evidence recovered from semen and hair at the crime scene. The genealogy research had produced a lead. The discarded cigarette had confirmed it. Brian Dripps was now the man investigators believed had entered Angie Dodge's apartment in June 1996. But there was another fact that made the discovery even harder to understand. Police had spoken with Dripps before. 5 days after Angie was killed, officers conducting a neighborhood canvass reportedly interviewed him because he lived nearby. His name had briefly entered the investigation in 1996. Then it disappeared from the case. 23 years later, detectives were returning to him. This time they had DNA. On the 15th of May 2019, investigators brought Brian Dripps in for questioning. The interview lasted approximately 5 hours. At first, detectives did not begin by revealing everything they knew. They asked about his life in Idaho Falls. They asked about the neighborhood. They asked about Angie. Then they confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to investigators, Dripps admitted that he had entered Angie's apartment alone. He admitted sexually assaulting and killing her. Court records later described his account of consuming alcohol and drugs before the attack. Dripps claimed that killing Angie had not been his original intention. But Angie had been attacked inside her own home. She had been 18 years old. And the physical evidence now connected Dripps to the crime. That night, he was arrested and charged with rape and first-degree murder. The case had finally reached the person whose DNA had been preserved since 1996. But the arrest did more than identify Angie's killer. It proved that the confession used to convict another man had led the case in the wrong direction. Christopher Tapp was 20 years old when Idaho Falls police began questioning him in January 1997. He had known people within Angie's wider social circle. He had also been seen at a gathering Angie attended before her death, but knowing Angie was not evidence that he had killed her. During a period of approximately 3.5 weeks, Tapp was questioned 9 times for a combined total of about 25 hours. His statements changed repeatedly. At first, he said he knew nothing about the murder. Later, his account changed as investigators introduced names, theories, and details. Over time, Tapp moved from denying any knowledge of the crime to placing himself inside the apartment. Experts who later studied the recordings argued that investigators had supplied information, challenged his memory, offered possible leniency, and threatened severe punishment. Tapp eventually confessed to participating in the attack, but the DNA evidence excluded him. No physical evidence placed him inside Angie's apartment. Prosecutors argued that other men had committed the sexual assault and that Tapp had participated in the murder. In 1998, a jury convicted him of rape and murder. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. The unidentified DNA profile remained in the evidence. The man whose DNA it belonged to remained free. As the years passed, legal advocates, forensic experts, and members of the public began examining Tapp's confession more closely. The changing stories raised concerns. The interrogation methods raised concerns, and the absence of physical evidence became impossible to separate from the case. Carol Dodge also continued searching. Her commitment was not to preserve the original conviction. It was to discover what had happened to Angie. By 2017, the case against Tapp had weakened considerably. His rape conviction was vacated. His sentence for murder was reduced to time already served. After approximately 20 years in prison, he was released. But he was not yet fully exonerated. The murder conviction remained attached to his name, and the person who left DNA at Angie's crime scene had still not been identified. That changed after the arrest of Brian Dripps. Dripps's DNA matched the evidence. Investigators said he admitted acting alone. The prosecution could no longer maintain that Tapp had participated alongside unidentified attackers. On the 17th of July, 2019, a judge dismissed the remaining charge against Christopher Tapp. After more than 2 decades, his name was formally cleared. The same genetic investigation that identified Brian Dripps had helped establish what the crime scene evidence had suggested for years. Tapp was not the man who attacked Angie Dodge. The case cannot be understood without Carol Dodge. She had lost her only daughter. She had endured years of hearings, interviews, scientific reports, and unanswered questions. She also made a decision that many people would have found difficult. She accepted the possibility that the man convicted of Angie's murder might be innocent. Supporting a new investigation did not weaken her demand for justice. It strengthened it. Carol pressed investigators and scientists to continue examining the DNA. She learned about new testing methods. She supported the use of genetic genealogy. And when the technology produced a difficult, incomplete family tree, she encouraged the researchers to continue. Her search was not for a convenient conclusion. It was for the person whose DNA had been left behind. That persistence helped free Christopher Tapp. It also helped identify Brian Dripps. But even when the arrest came, there was no simple victory. A conviction could answer who attacked Angie. It could not restore the years her family had lost. It could not return Angie to the life she should have lived. On the 9th of February, 2021, Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and rape. The plea meant the case would not proceed to a full trial. There would be no jury presentation of every piece of evidence. No extended public examination of how the investigation had failed to identify him in 1996. But there would be a legal finding of responsibility. At his sentencing hearing on the 8th of June, 2021, Angie's relatives described the effect her death had carried through their family for 25 years. Dripps apologized. The court sentenced him to a minimum of 20 years to life in prison. The sentence closed the prosecution. It did not close every question. Why had investigators accepted a confession that conflicted with DNA evidence? Why had Dripps's brief neighborhood interview in 1996 led nowhere? How many years might have been saved if the unidentified biological evidence had been treated as a warning that the original theory was wrong. The case had produced two devastating failures. A young woman had been killed, and an innocent man had lost approximately 20 years of his freedom. Both outcomes were connected by the same unanswered DNA profile. The Angie Dodge investigation demonstrated both the power and the danger of evidence. A confession can sound convincing even when it is false. DNA can identify a person, but only when investigators have something to compare it with. And genetic genealogy can reveal a suspect through relatives who may have no connection to the crime. That final point has created an ongoing debate. People upload genetic information to genealogy databases to find family members or learn about their ancestry. But depending on a platform's policies and a user's choices, those profiles may also help investigators identify relatives connected to serious crimes. One person's DNA can reveal information about an entire family network. Supporters argue that the method can solve murders, identify unknown victims, and correct wrongful convictions. Critics question how genetic information should be accessed, how consent should work, and what limits law enforcement should face. Angie's case contains both sides of that debate. Genetic searching once contributed to suspicion falling on an innocent filmmaker who was later eliminated by direct DNA testing. Years later, a more advanced genealogy investigation correctly identified Brian Dripps. The family tree did not convict him. It pointed investigators toward him. The direct DNA match, his admissions, and his guilty plea completed the case. That distinction matters. Genealogy created the lead. Forensic testing confirmed the identity. For almost 23 years, the answer existed without a name. It was preserved in biological material collected from Angie Dodge's apartment. It excluded Christopher Tapp. It eliminated other suspects. It survived unsuccessful comparisons, false leads, and changing investigative theories. Then technology reached a point where investigators no longer needed the killer to be inside a criminal database. They only needed distant relatives, a few shared segments of DNA, a marriage record, an obituary, a child whose surname had changed, and a cigarette discarded from a moving car. Together, those fragments led investigators back to a man who had once lived directly across the street from Angie, a man police had briefly spoken to 5 days after her death. Brian Leigh Dripps had not been discovered because he suddenly came forward. He was discovered because the evidence never stopped pointing toward the person who left it. Angie Dodge was more than the center of a cold case. She was an 18-year-old daughter, sister, and friend whose future was taken inside the home where she should have been safe. Christopher Tapp was more than an error in an old investigation. He was a man who spent approximately 20 years in prison while evidence from the crime scene excluded him. And Carol Dodge was more than a grieving mother waiting for authorities to act. She challenged the result she had once accepted and continued searching until the evidence was finally connected to the correct person. The legal case now has an answer, but the final question extends far beyond Idaho Falls. In police evidence rooms across the world, how many unidentified DNA profiles are still waiting? How many belong to people whose names have never appeared in an investigation? And how many old cases will change when science finally discovers a path from an unknown profile to a family, to a discarded object, and ultimately to the truth? If this investigation stayed with you, subscribe to Dark Case Files for more carefully researched true crime documentaries. Share this video so Angie Dodge's story and the lessons from this investigation continue to reach others. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe genetic genealogy should be used to investigate every serious unsolved crime? Or should there be stricter limits on how family DNA is accessed? Your perspective matters.